What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, we're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. If you're listening to us currently on iTunes or Spotify, welcome in. Please leave us a detailed review and a 5-star rating. What's up, everybody, and welcome into another episode of the Sit Down. I am your host, Jeff Nadu, and today we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And the most fervent question I am asked on a regular basis is, what is the mafia doing today? Most notably, the powerful families, the five families, groups like the Gambino crime family. The federal government would allege that for a series of years now, this individual, Lorenzo Mannino, is the alleged and reputed boss of the Gambino crime family. What exactly do we know about Lorenzo Mannino? Well, today we're going to learn a little bit more about him. The story of Lorenzo Mannino next on the Sit Down. Lorenzo Mannino was born in the late 50s in and around Brooklyn, New York. He would come up in the 18th Avenue area of Bensonhurst. As we know, Bensonhurst is a major artery for the mafia here in New York City and in America, and it is a fertile ground for many. And I can't go through all of them because there are so many people that came up in and around this area. And people in the Gambino crime family include Sammy the Bull, Mikey Scars, DiLeonardo, those kind of guys. This is a fertile ground for a lot of different families in the American Mafia in Bensonhurst. Now, when we talk about Lorenzo Mannino, when we talk about the Sicilians in the Gambino crime family, because if you know anything about Mannino, that name is very pronounced in Sicily when it comes to the mafia. And all of the guys that are in the Sicilian crew, or at one point were in the Sicilian crew, obviously had major ties back to their native country. And when you talk about the Sicilian crew, you can't not talk about John Gambino. Now, the Sicilians have had a crew for decades in the Gambino crime family, and John Gambino is one of the more notable ones. According to what we know, John Gambino was made when the books opened in and around 1976. That said, at one point by 1980, the head of the Sicilian crew was not John Gambino. It was actually a person called Antonino Nino Inzerillo. Now, in and around 1980, Mr. Inzerillo disappears. Okay, and not long after Inzerillo disappears, Paul Castellano decides to, end the crew. Not end it, but, disband it, essentially. Once John Gotti takes over, Gotti gets a change of heart and decides to reintroduce the Sicilian crew, and we would find that out from Sammy Gravano. He discusses that there was a meeting held at a restaurant in Brooklyn, and John Gambino is basically made capo di cine of the family. According to Gravano, quote, "We spoke to John Gambino first on the side. We were promoted him to the position of capo di cine. We told him that this was official from a representante and that he was now that guy. He was going to take over this Ticine that was left abandoned by Paul Castellano. We went inside a bigger room and excused everybody who wasn't a friend of ours. I believe John told some of the people, like his brother and them, to be excused. They left. John Gambino introduced us first as committee to John Gotti, and that John Gotti was our new boss. He introduced us and our positions. We turned around and we introduced them to John as their new capo di cine, and whatever they had in their life, any problems, that they were to see John Gambino first. They then went by some of the same basic rules, and when you become a friend of ours, that narcotics wouldn't be allowed. Basically, we didn't go through all the rules and regulations. They already knew it. They were friends of ours already and been friends of ours for years. So again, John Gambino, by Gotti taking over, becomes captain of the Sicilian crew. And one of his young associates at the time was the up-and-coming Lorenzo Mannino. By that point, Mannino in the mid to late 80s is in his mid to late 20s. Also around and in photos at that time included an unknown who would eventually become the man we know it as Frank Cali. And what these guys were doing is they were students of the game under one of the greatest teachers, a man in John Gambino who really represented old school, old world Sicilian, right? And what do we know about those old school people? The old school men in the mafia today that came up in that generation, they're not made again. We don't see those people. And that's one of the declines of the mafia over all these years. It doesn't matter whether it's Sicily. It doesn't matter if it's Naples. It doesn't matter where it is. These individuals that come from these places, they're steeped in old world tradition. And eventually, John Gambino realizes it because in 1988, he needs to handle a problem in his own family, his blood family. One of his relatives is beaten to death by a person called Francesco Aliveri. John Gambino wants him whacked. He then goes to the boss of the family, John Gotti, and says, look, I need this guy to go. Now, what we know about Aliveri is he was not a mobster. From what I understand, he worked at a pasta factory and lives in Queens. He gets into an argument with this Gambino and beats him to death with his sons. So he's a marked man. John Gambino makes it clear, though, he wants Lorenzo Mannino involved in this piece of work. Gotti says, okay, but I want Sammy to overrun this and be kind of the eyes and ears, the overseer. Remember, Gravano is a high-ranking member of the family, but I think John says, look, I want my guy involved to make sure everything goes right. And we ask ourselves, back then, it was still very normal to become a member of the family. To become a member, you had to kill somebody or take part in a murder. Why do the mob, why do gangs do that? Well, it's really simple. Gangs, criminal organizations want someone to kill due to the fact that A, they're then subservient to that family, and B, killing someone takes the empathy out of someone. If you kill someone, you're someone who doesn't have any more empathy in you. And that's what these people want, the people that run these families. Having empathy in that life means nothing, and it's not useful in that life. And they wanted Lorenzo Manino to be a part of that because they viewed him as someone who was respectable, someone who was a man, and someone who could eventually be one of them. Now, I want to go through what we know or alleged to know happens. And remember, Mannino is involved. According to Sammy Gravano, on May 3rd, 1988, after stalking Mr. Aliveri, who lived in Astoria, Queens, he is spotted. They're outside of his home. According to Gravano, he and Mr. Mannino stationed themselves near the Aliveri house. And Mannino is the driver of the vehicle. Gravano would then state that three other men stayed in a second stolen car a few, area away. My role, according to Gravano, was backup shooter as well as supervisor of the hit. He added that he notified the others by walkie-talkie when Mr. Mannino saw Mr. Aliveri coming out of his house. We then would find out that the main shooter, a person called Robert Basaccia, who I did a video on here, I urge you to check that out. He's the main shooter. One of his people alongside with him was Ozzie Stantini. According to Gravano, Bobby ran out and shot him a couple of times. They then got into their cars and went back to Brooklyn. So again, Mannino is now on the hook. He's taking part in a hit, and this goes a long way with someone like John Gotti. And as we know, and if you've ever heard, there's a book written about this, the Gotti tapes. We hear Gotti on various conversations discussing all sorts of people. And at one point, he mentions a person called Lorenzo. He would state, quote, he calls me Mr. Gotti. And that, quote, Lorenzo is a real fucking man. So a lot of high praise for Lorenzo Mannino. Lorenzo Mannino is a young guy. He's in his late 20s. And Mr. Gotti is already impressed by him. And we would find out down the road, it wasn't just him that he was impressed by. He was impressed by Richie Martino up in the Bronx. Gotti stated, we're going to be real proud of these guys someday. These are the guys, the real fucking men, as John Gotti talked about, that we now see years later, like Mannino, that are in control. And if you look at the title of this video, John Gotti had that respect. He knew what Mannino was going to be. And that's what made, to me, John Gotti very intelligent. He was willing to see that. He saw the future, and he had to be able to see the future in that life. The problem for Mannino, though, is his profiles going up. He's obviously allegedly involved in major narcotics deals. He had took part in a murder. He was becoming very well represented in and around Brooklyn. And what that does is it brings law enforcement scrutiny. Eventually, alongside John Gambino, the captain of the Sicilian crew, alongside a person called Joe Gambino, they are indicted by the feds on RICO. One of the RICO charges is the hit on Francesco Aliveri, and everything from extortion to narcotics to loan sharking, the racketeering gamut. And guess who becomes the main witness? As we know, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. Eventually, Mr. Mannino sees the writing on the wall and pleads guilty in this case. He would be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and we would not hear much from Mr. Mannino over the next 10 years until November 24th, when Mannino is released from federal prison. So he serves about a 10 spot inside the feds. It's alleged that around that time, he becomes a made member of the Gambino crime family. So it wasn't until the 2000s, and when Mr. Mannino gets out, he becomes a made member of that Borgata. Now, in 2009, this is where we start seeing the stature of Mannino. He is the basic acting captain, if there ever is one, in that Sicilian crew. Obviously, John Gambino is the captain, but by 2009, John Gambino takes on a committee role in the Gambino crime family. We know that they create committees, and by that point, it's likely John Gambino is made that guy, and that would assume that around 2009, Mannino becomes the acting captain of the Sicilian crew. That takes us to 2009, when the infamous meeting involving mobsters at La Grilla restaurant in Kenilworth, New Jersey happens. And this comes from the Nicky Skins Stefanelli tape. Stefanelli becomes a rat and then takes himself out. But he records a meeting at La Grilla restaurant. Some of the attendees include Lorenzo Mannino, John Gambino, Alphonse Trucchio, Michael Rockefort, and Philly high-end mobsters Joseph Lagambi, Joe Scoops Licata, and others. Now, from what we know about this meal that day, there was all sorts of things that went on. Let's first talk about what the guys ate that day. According to what we know, the tab was $902. Their orders would include 3 seafood salads, a Cajun calamari, a grilled filet mignon, yellowfish tuna, Chilean sea bass, chicken with broccoli rabe, 4 orders of red snapper soup, 1 order of diver scallops, a cod lunch special with 1/2 order of linguine, as well as sides that included 2 pots of hot peppers with onions, and desserts were nice: cheesecake, shortcake with fresh berries. It was all washed down, according to Gangland News, with 7 bottles of Fiji water, 4 bottles of wine, and 1 200 bottle of Bionde Santi 01. Now, we did not learn what the tip was. That said, obviously the mobsters had a really nice lunch that day. What did these guys talk about? Well, a lot of it was quite colorful, and a lot of it came from Joseph Uncle Joe Lagambi. At one point, Joseph Lagambi discussed some of the people that he was dealing with, including a hapless mobster by the name of Vincent Beeps Santorino. At one point, they would discuss the hapless Santorino, saying, quote, he was so poor, he was selling cakes out of the trunk of his car. Joseph Scoops Licata would lament about Santorino, quote, I can't make 3 cents with him. Now, in another discussion, Mr. Lagambi laments about a person called Danny D'Ambrosio, a South Philadelphia bookmaker and reputed associate whose underworld allegiance had often been questioned. Lagambi would say that a few years earlier, D'Ambrosio's father had come to see him at his South Philadelphia home in Packer Park, claiming the FBI had told him the mob was, quote, going to kill his son, Danny. Lagambi would quote to the table, his father comes over to my house about 3 or 4 years ago, said the FBI said he was going to kill my son. He was telling me this on the step. I said, what are you talking about? Don't ever come around this house again. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I mean, that's the kind of fucking nuts you're dealing with. He would also state to the table that Joey, quote, sends words in reference to skinny Joey Merlino. And this was the kind of discussions they had. They would just kind of joke about stuff. They talked about the wild people they were dealing with. They made references to Dave Schratweiser at one point. They would talk about all sorts of stuff. Even one guy asked, what was Joey going to do when he gets out of prison? And they were just kind of joking, having a good time. But we see the stature of who's at this table. John Gambino, Joe Legambi, Lorenzo Mannino. So again, stature. Now, what we also know, though, is eventually John Gambino gets older, he gets sick, and eventually dies in 2017. Now, the thought has always been, when did Lorenzo Mannino take over? We have to feel that he ran roughshod, him and Dom Cefalu, who was also Sicilian. The long-standing thought is that over the last 15 years, Dominic Cefalu has been the head guy in the Gambino crime family. I don't agree. I always have believed that Lorenzo Mannino was at some point a high-ranking decision maker in this family. And once Francesco Cali died, who, again, I also do not believe was an acting boss or boss of this family. I believe in my heart, and I could be wrong, and I maybe am wrong. I believe that for a long period of time, the head of this family, the end decision maker, could be Lorenzo Mannino. It could be other people. But he has largely been, since 2009, an extremely high-ranking member. We also know of his major relations with some of the other very powerful people in this family, including Bo Filippelli, who is a construction magnate, a lot of guys making a lot of money. We know that the head of the Sicilian crew, Joseph Lanni, is close to Mr. Mannino. We know that Mr. Mannino is very close with Serbian crime associate and heavyweight Miljeta Miljanic, who has ties to all sorts of groups. Lorenzo Mannino is very, very powerful. And when you go to Bensonhurst today, if you went there, you will see the treatment that Mr. Mannino gets, whether it's at Il Calicero, which is a restaurant, whether it's at a social club, whether it's at a bar. Mr. Mannino can park anywhere he wants. And I liken him to the Sonny character in A Bronx Tale. He is extremely well respected. Everybody knows who he is. Nobody fucks with him. And he runs a lot. He owns real estate. He owns things. He has, legitimate business. He's very well thought of. He's very well regarded. He's like a god in that neighborhood. In this small little part of Brooklyn, it's still very Italian, and it's still very, very mobbed up, if you want to call it that. Do I think the feds will ever get to Mr. Mannino? Probably not. He's extremely well insulated. He's well thought of, and he is one of the most powerful people, if there is powerful people, still today in the American Mafia. The Gambino crime family is still one of the most foremost mafia authorities in America. Whether they're powerful is another question. But in this line of work, Mr. Mannino is still very well thought of. And we go back to the quote from John Gotti so many years before. When it comes to Lorenzo Mannino, we're going to be real proud of this guy someday. We ended up, according to them, they likely were. Lorenzo Mannino, a very interesting man, even at one point referenced by Barack Obama in a speech. Look that up. I'll leave that out of this. I don't want to get too into politics. That said, if there is power in the mob today, it's Lorenzo Mannino. I hope you enjoyed this show. As always, if you enjoy what we're doing, please hit that like button and do me a favor. Hit that super thanks icon below the video. Show some love to me and the channel. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.